The Pacific Solution is the name given to the Government of Australia policy of transporting asylum seekers to detention centres on island nations in the Pacific Ocean, rather than allowing them to land on the Australian mainland. Initially implemented from 2001 to 2007. It had bipartisan support from the coalition and Labour opposition at the time. The Pacific Solution consisted of 3 central strategies. Thousands of islands were excised from Australia's migration zone or Australian territory. The Australian Defence Force commenced Operation Relax to intercept vessels carrying asylum seekers. And the asylum seekers were removed to detention centres in Nauru and on Manus Island, Papua New Guinea, while their refugee status was determined. A number of pieces of legislation enabled this policy. The policy was developed by the Howard government in response to the Tampa affair in August 2001 and the Children Overboard affair, and was implemented by then Australian Immigration Minister Philip Ruddock on the 28th of September before the 2001 federal election of the 24th of November. The policy was largely dismantled in 2008 by the first Rudd government following the election of the Labour Party. Chris Evans, the Minister for Immigration and Citizenship, described it as a cynical, costly and ultimately unsuccessful exercise. In August 2012, the succeeding Gillard government introduced a similar policy, reopening the Nauru and Manus detention centres for offshore processing. On the 19th of July 2013, newly returned Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, during his short-lived second term of office, announced that asylum seekers who come here by boat without a visa will never be settled in Australia, striking a regional resettlement arrangement between Australia and Papua New Guinea, colloquially known as the PNG solution, to divert all unauthorized maritime arrivals to mandatory detention on Manus Island with no possibility of attaining Australian residency. The Operation Sovereign Borders policy took over from the Pacific Solution after the 2013 federal election, won by the coalition. It commenced on the 18th of September 2013 under the new Abbott government. On the 31st of March 2019, Operation Sovereign Borders reported that there were no people held in the detention centre on Nauru, which had been closed, and the Manus Centre had been officially closed on the 31st of October 2017. However, on the 30th of September 2019, the total number of asylum seekers still in PNG and Nauru was 562, being housed in alternative accommodation. The Australian government passed legislation on the 27th of September 2001, with amendments to the Commonwealth Migration Act 1958, enacted by the Migration Legislation Amendment, by redefining the area of Australian territory that could be landed upon and then legitimately used for claims of asylum, and by removing any intercepted people to third countries for processing. The aim was to deter future asylum seekers from making the dangerous journey by boat, once they knew that their trip would probably not end with a legitimate claim for asylum in Australia. On the 28th of October 2001, at his 2001 election campaign policy launch, Prime Minister John Howard said, "We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come." In an effort to build support for the policy, asylum seekers were intercepted at sea while sailing from Indonesia and moved using Australian naval vessels. Detention centres were set up on Christmas Island, Manus Island in Papua New Guinea, and on the island nation of Nauru. Some were also accepted for processing by New Zealand. Most of the asylum seekers came from Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, China, and Vietnam. The last asylum seekers to be detained on Nauru before the end of the policy had come from Sri Lanka and Myanmar. Arrivals dropped from a total of 5,516 people in 2001 to one arrival in 2002 after implementation of the policy, and remained below 150 annually until 2008. The removal of the Taliban from power in Afghanistan may have had some effect in this decrease, as nearly 6 million Afghans had returned to Afghanistan since 2002, almost a quarter of the country's population at the time. 4 boats were successfully returned to Indonesian waters out of the 12 suspected illegal entry vessels intercepted by the Navy during Operation Relax during 2001-2002. Having made 10 attempts to enforce the policy, based on judgments of whether it was safe to do so or not, 3 men allegedly drowned trying to swim back to shore after returning to Indonesia. In November 2003, a boat carrying 53 passengers was successfully deterred. And in March 2004, Customs returned a boat with 15 people after interception at the Ashmore Islands. The success rate was 36% of boats, or 31% of asylum seekers sent back to Indonesia. Details of operations from 2005 to 2008 are scant. Operation Resolute began in July 2006. Run jointly by the Australian Customs and Border Protection Service and the Australian Defence Force. During the Pachi